Here I am on the beach. Beautiful waves, sand, couple chairs. There's a legend that Alexander the Great was a great admirer of the pre-Socratic philosopher Diogenes. And upon visiting Diogenes on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, Alexander approached him, stood over him on the beach, and implored him, asking him what he, Alexander, could do for him, Diogenes, and he would grant it, if it were just in his power to do so. Now, Diogenes is purported to have said, "You can get out of my sun." Not to block another source of illumination in the world. Maybe that's right for Diogenes. The human beings come down to two basic types: those who block the rays of illumination and those who do not. In modern speak, we say it's better to be a window than a door, as the adage goes. Would that it were so simple, of course. Thankfully, human beings are not so simple, not so stratified into a kind of reverse anthropomorphic projection of doors and windows. No, in today's readings and in the module before you, you may have noticed that human existence is comprised of at least two cosmologies, the external and the internal. Now, what do we mean? The 19th century renowned German philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote that two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, oftener and more steadily when I reflect on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Now, Kant's point is to draw a clear connection between the mystery of two cosmological typologies, one internal to his own life and one external within the universe. There are indeed the stars above us and the stars within us. In terms of physics, it's interesting to note that the macroscopic and microscopic universe actually look quite similar. Atoms are in orbit like planets. Quantum mechanics excludes the notion of causal behavior underlying statistical descriptions, just as we know that an infinite amount of knowledge about deterministic behavior in the universe would be necessary in order to posit a causal universe. In any event, it's in the external or out there where we often first posit the gods. The anthropological reasons for doing so we've already discussed in Module 2. But for our current module, we continue on the theological theme of our relationship to the divine or sacred in the universe. Is God out there, in short? Is God here? Is God listening or speaking? Now, I'm going to appeal to three separate elevations for interpreting this, if you will, and use this term elevation, as you'll find me often doing in the course, as a kind of typology for the purpose of our interpretation of the reading. Think of being in an aircraft and viewing this question of who God really is. Who is the sacred? Or what is the divinely genuine from three vantage points? These being 10,000 feet, or religiously specific doctrine, 20,000 feet, or moving to the theisms, such as pantheism or panentheism, and third, 30,000 feet, or perhaps kind of spiritual humanism. Now first, at 10,000 feet, or religious and doctrinal level, Vinci contrasts the doctrine of Christ with the evolution of the cosmos, beginning with the theory of the Big Bang. No, not the television sitcom. Vinci considers the views of Delio and Rahner and discusses the general theme of the cosmic Christ, whereby at its outer limit of theological application, Christ is a symbol of liberation accessible to all of humanity and the cosmos. Now, a strength of Delio and Vinci's position is evident in the work of theologian David Tracy and philosopher Paul Ricoeur, whereby the symbol is seen as an inexhaustible resource, seen to be always overflowing with new meaning and possibility for interpretation. The symbol is an ur, a source, that is, which comes from the term for Abraham's birthplace, Ur, literally the source, the ground, the origin of all. Now, symbols always signify, right? As I noted, some inexhaustible truth. For instance, a stop sign. It's a symbol that signifies you should stop here, not just at this particular time, but every time you see this sign everywhere in the world, please stop. A wedding ring is a symbol of loyalty, fidelity, trust, respect, love, and more. And broken promises trespass the power of the symbol, betraying the power of the thing signified by the symbol, in the last case, marriage. But The same is true of other symbols. Run a stop sign, and you've trespassed a shared part of the wider social contract. That we will stop here, that we will stop at this place every time. Symbols communicate this kind of power every time, and breaking them can mean significant loss. And yet, at the vantage point of religiously specific doctrine, pressed to their limits, symbols are also acontextual and ahistorical. It's like putting a stop sign in outer space. For instance, a popular move of theology in response to science is to reimagine what's called the cosmic Christ, or to externalize and decontextualize the life and message of Jesus Christ, which, when it is extrapolated to a symbol, does feel vague. The effort of theologians like Delio and Rahner are to render the cosmic Christ in a way that allows for historical and existential agency without, in effect, trading the second person of the Trinity for the third person of the Trinity, or that is, turning Christ into pure spirit. In a response to science, when we abstract the historicity of signature religious figures like Christ into a broader universal appeal, we succeed somewhat, but the negative result from the cosmic Christ, say, is a disembodied, uncommunicative black hole of sorts, which you know has immense mass in the universe, but offers no light by which you might be in relationship with it. Vinci offers a way to resolve this abstraction in the cosmic Christ. So you'll want to pay attention to how Vinci sees the relationship between incarnational theology and epiphanic, or think Revelation, epiphanic theology, in order to respond to the problems inherent in the cosmic Christ. Okay, moving on. Next, at 20,000 feet, or more unfettered from traditional doctrinal structures, Hout argues that the existence of God is most meaningful for human beings when we do not adopt an authoritarian image, but instead see God in Revelation itself as motivating our deep human desire to know. This turns the mind from a medieval theological affirmation of, say, doctrinal fidelity to a particular perspective, and instead moves us to the Augustinian aspiration of faith-seeking understanding in the world. In this sense, the human being lives in covenantal relationship with God, the truth of which takes a lifetime to discern. And yet, even as I am busy interpreting that covenant daily, the promise of relationship itself is not dependent on me fully understanding it. God's promise is not dependent upon my limited knowledge. Just because I can't see through the storm doesn't mean the headlights aren't on, so to speak. The human yearning for the future is grounded in the hope of this promise, in the Christocentric lens. Now, at its extreme limit, in a postmodern context, I may live into this promise outside of any community of faith, any particular community. And I could live in this promise whereby the promise of covenant is not grounded in any particular religious tradition or community. I call myself a Christian, but I've never attended any particular congregation or have any genuine sense of a Christian community or body around me. Okay, this might be similar. The hope for promise is located in the community where Christ is the head of the body. If I live a disembodied faith, then ultimately I participate in a form of spiritual monasticism that is not grounded in Christ or Christocentric, or perhaps I exist in a form of spiritual humanism. That is, if I'm grounded in universal values that are evident in Jesus among others, even as I see these universal values in all of the great traditions. Okay, and third, at 30,000 feet, we take up this upper limit of, say, spiritual humanism, or how McIntosh makes a case for the evolution of human spiritual consciousness, which has greatly evolved in the past 50,000 years, even as the physiological structure, interestingly enough, of our brains has remained relatively the same. What we know is that human beings have a capacity to construct classic meaning in a particular way. Now, before dipping into McIntosh's point, first, a word about the term classic would be important for our understanding of what he means here. The classic. We have specific narratives around the world that are classic for us. Now, a classic, like a symbol, is a kind of story or narrative that appears to withstand the slings and arrows of time and rancor. It has staying power. The classic is the surprising story that sticks around, like a friend who ends up being a part of the family. Our favorite books are like that. If they had feet, they'd be resting on our end table, so that's where we put them anyway. A classic is also always inexhaustible in its potential for reinterpretation that transcends its own particular context. Now, classics are stories, and both necessary and sufficient for explaining the ontology of being human. So, examples: the Genesis account of the first humans, the suffering and the story of Job, the journey deeply into the world of Homer's Odyssey. Or consider James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, wherein Baldwin repeatedly bears witness to the injustices and urges healing in the social fabric before it is torn beyond repair. These narratives, all of them, are classics insofar as their veracity or truth value appears to span across time. Some by decades, others by millennia. But because they're core stories, they're classic, about the human quest for justice and love. And they're passed along from generation to generation. Okay, now let's return to McIntosh. McIntosh is suggesting ultimately that spiritual consciousness will evolve a kind of spiritual renaissance, whereby truth, beauty, and goodness will be classics. You hear that? Classics for us that will resonate beyond our own proprietary religious sense of belonging. He's really taking aim at the kind of doctrinal position at the 10,000-foot value. The most proprietary is represented by much of the traditional religious freight that both Vinci and Hout represent in their respective work. And yet, as you've read McIntosh in this class, haven't you also sensed he's just as proprietary? Perhaps he's proprietary of a whole stable of values that he views as classic and that he believes stand above others. Now, if I'm Vinci and I aspire to the cosmic Christ, at least I know in concrete terms just what kind of abstraction I have in mind. For his part, McIntosh suggests that the next evolution of spiritual consciousness and spiritual leadership will fulfill people's existential need for self-actualization. That's very Aristotelian of him. And the core values of that particular consciousness will be predicated on their capacity to emit truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, those are the classic values. Now, like McIntosh, I do want to believe that spiritual relationship can and should bring about individual and collective well-being based on the values, classic, yes, of truth, beauty, and goodness. But unlike McIntosh, I think he and I have a different operational theological anthropology at work here. I mean, not to be a buzzkill, but I'm skeptical of the human capacity to frame meaning systems of truth, beauty, and goodness, classic or otherwise, to frame these unalloyed from the abuse of power. We might deceive ourselves so that the truth is not in us, after all. In fact, our classic narratives admit as much. The shining light of justice is a beauty to behold, but as we learned last week, even injustice may take place through thick rationalizations to the beauty of justice itself. And furthermore, whose truth, beauty, and goodness does McIntosh have in mind? Are these values classic insofar as they're truly universal, or are they always beholden to particular biases given their particular context? McIntosh's perspective on the next spiritual climb for our humanity is akin to Vinci's interpretation of the cosmic Christ, but this time, with McIntosh, we have the abstracted cosmic human being, and not Christ that is at work. I admire how much McIntosh has a lot more trust in the human capacity to get it right than perhaps I do. But when our leaders exhibit a desire to raise our collective spiritual consciousness, as McIntosh suggests, we also know that sometimes those very leaders excel to become prophets, and sometimes prophets pay the ultimate price. Now finally, what does McIntosh have in mind for the sacred? in the evolutionary process. That is, does evolutionary spirituality or consciousness have in mind a divine object for the sake of adoration? Either way, how do we communicate, is my point, with the sacred that he has in mind? I'm not picking on McIntosh. I want to demonstrate to you through this assessment of our particular readings, that we should ask the hard questions and engage in what I've called the theological archaeology and entrust ourselves to be critical where necessary. It's important. It's a part of the freedom of expression and capacity to engage honestly in theological discourse today. In each of these elevations, I noted for heuristic purposes, I suggested, for the purpose of thinking categorically together, we can ask ourselves this question. It is the one I, in fact, ask myself often related to the sacred. Here it is. When I experience awe and wonder at the cosmos, like last night when I sat under the stars, do I have in mind an object of the sacred, of divinity, and of God that transcends my limits? As God also, does he hear or she hear my adoration, my petition, my confession? And if the sacred does indeed hear me in my anthropomorphic need to put ears on the cosmos, does God think about me, about you, about any of us? Maybe McIntosh is right. After all, perhaps our problems are all fundamentally problems of our human consciousness, and that we are, all of us, actually, that we're here at all begs the question not of consciousness, but of our purpose. That's what I might add. What do we do here now that we're here? Now, this is a question of our teleology and our teleological bearing in the world. But teleology is in our next module, and I don't wish to get too far ahead. I don't wish to stand in the rays of your current illumination in this module. So back to the sun with me. Keep writing. Stellar observations for the module. I'm reading your work. And me looking relaxed right here on the beach is just a ruse, really. It's just a dream. It's just a cosmic Dr. Trice abstracted from my daily life. But sometimes a ruse is a painless deception after all. Talk to you soon.